In the autumn of 1965, the world stood on the brink of a new Cold War order. In Indonesia, the largest archipelago nation on Earth, a fragile balance of power was about to shatter. President Sukarno, a charismatic leader who had united the country through his guided democracy, was at the height of his influence. But beneath the surface, tensions between the military, religious groups, and the world's third largest communist party were reaching a breaking point. On the night of September 30th, a group of military officers calling themselves the 30 September Movement kidnapped and executed 6 of Indonesia's top generals. It was a chaotic, violent event that would be used as the pretext for something far more terrifying. Within weeks, a nationwide purge began. What followed was not just a political crackdown, but one of the largest mass killings of the 20th century. Over the course of 6 months, hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered. This is the story of the Indonesian mass killings of 1965 to 1966. A story of how a failed coup spiraled into a genocide, the role of foreign powers, and how a nation tried to erase its own history. The events began in the early hours of October 1st, 1965. A group of militants claiming to be acting to protect President Sukarno from a council of generals plotting a coup abducted 6 high-ranking army officers from their homes in Jakarta. They were taken to a location known as the Lubang Buaya, or Crocodile Hole, where they were executed. The movement, led by Lieutenant Colonel Untung, broadcast a message claiming they had seized power to prevent a CIA-backed coup. But the movement was disorganized. They failed to capture the most important target, General Abdul Haris Nasution, who escaped, and Major General Suharto, who was not targeted. Suharto, the commander of the Army Strategic Reserve, moved quickly. By the evening of October 1st, he had retaken the radio station and the presidential palace. He did not negotiate. Instead, he launched a propaganda campaign that would define the next 3 decades. The army leadership, led by Suharto, immediately blamed the Communist Party of Indonesia, the PKY, for the coup attempt. They claimed the PKY had orchestrated the murders to seize power. The reality, as historians and declassified documents later revealed, was far more complex. The 30 September movement was likely a faction within the military itself, with only tenuous links to the PKA. But the narrative was set. The army declared that the PKY was a cancer that had to be cut out. They banned independent news sources, controlled the flow of information, and incited the public. Graphic images of the murdered generals, some mutilated in ways that may have been exaggerated, were circulated to fuel public outrage. The army's message was clear. The PKY was the enemy of the nation, of God, and of the people. And the people were given a green light to act. The Purge begins, October to December 1965. The Purge did not start as a spontaneous riot. It was organised. In the weeks following the coup attempt, the army began to mobilise civilian groups. Student organisations like Kami and Kapi, backed by the military, took to the streets, demanding the banning of the PKI. In Jakarta and West Java, thousands of PKI activists were arrested. But the violence soon spread to the rural heartlands of Central Java, East Java and Bali, areas where the PKY had its strongest support. The killing was systematic. In many areas, the army did not do the killing themselves. Instead, they handed lists of names to local militias, religious groups and vigilantes. In East Java and Bali, Islamic youth groups, such as the Ansar, were mobilised to cleanse their villages of communists. The targets were not just party leaders. Farmers, teachers, artists, trade unionists, and even illiterate peasants who were suspected of being leftists were hunted down. In some villages, the military demanded that village heads provide lists of communists. Those on the list were taken away, often at night, and executed. The scale of the violence was staggering. In Bali, where the PKI had a significant presence, an estimated 80,000 people were killed, roughly 5% of the island's population. In some villages, the entire population was wiped out. The methods were brutal. While some were shot, many were killed with machetes, sickles, and bamboo spears. The goal was not just to kill, but to terrorise. The bodies were often dumped in rivers or shallow graves. In East Java, the smell of decaying flesh was said to be so strong that it affected the air quality in nearby towns. This was not a civil war, it was a one-sided slaughter. The PKI, despite being a powerful political force, offered little armed resistance. They were caught off guard, and the army's control over the military machine was absolute. The global conspiracy, foreign involvement. While the killing was happening on the ground in Indonesia, a silent conspiracy was unfolding in Washington and London. The Cold War was at its height, and the United States viewed the rise of communism in Southeast Asia as an existential threat. Declassified documents reveal that the US and UK governments were not merely aware of the massacres, they were actively facilitating them. The US Embassy in Jakarta provided the Indonesian army with lists of up to 5,000 suspected PKI officials. These lists were used by death squads to identify their targets. American officials, including political officer Robert Martins, later admitted to drawing up these lists and handing them over to the army. But the involvement went deeper. The US and UK engaged in black propaganda campaigns. They spread false rumours, forged documents, and used clandestine radio broadcasts to incite hatred against the PKY and President Sukarno. The British Foreign Office, in particular, was instrumental in these operations, seeking to remove Sukarno, who had opposed the formation of Malaysia, a British ally. The US government was ecstatic about the killings. In a cable from the US Embassy, an official wrote that the Purge was a fantastic switch that had occurred over just 10 weeks. They saw it as a victory for the West, a way to flip Indonesia from a non-aligned, socialist-leaning nation to a pro-Western ally. The CIA even considered assassinating Sukarno, though they ultimately decided against it. Instead, they supported the army's takeover. The US provided financial aid, communications equipment, and military training to the very forces that were carrying out the mass murder. This was not a case of looking the other way. It was active complicity. The US and UK knew that the purge would result in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, and they supported it anyway. As one US official later put it, there's a time when you have to strike hard at a decisive moment. The international community, led by the West, celebrated the outcome. The New York Times called it a triumph for the West. The UK's The Times described it as the best news for years in Asia. The human cost was ignored in the pursuit of geopolitical strategy. The aftermath, the rise of Suharto. By March 1966, the killing had largely subsided. The PKI was destroyed, its leadership was dead or in hiding, its organisation was banned, and President Sukarno, the founding father of Indonesia, was stripped of his power. In March 1966, Suharto forced Sukarno to transfer his authority to him through the superpowers decree. 2 years later, in 1968, Suharto was formally elected president. He would rule Indonesia for the next 32 years. The New Order regime, as Suharto called it, was built on the bones of the 1965 victims. The military became the dominant force in Indonesian politics, with officers placed in key government positions. The economy was opened up to foreign investment, and the country became a favourite of Western corporations. But the cost was high. The memory of 1965 was suppressed. The official history taught in schools was a sanitised version of events. The PKI was a traitorous organisation that tried to overthrow the government, and the army had heroically saved the nation. The victims were portrayed as communists who deserved their fate. For decades, the survivors and families of the victims lived in fear. To speak of the killings was to invite arrest, torture, or death. The stigma of being a communist or a sympathiser followed families for generations. Children of victims were barred from certain jobs and universities. The truth was buried under layers of propaganda and silence, but the scars were deep. The killings had shattered the social fabric of Indonesia. Trust between neighbours, between religious groups, and between the people and the state was broken. Legacy and truth. It was not until the fall of Suharto in 1998 that the silence began to break. The Reformasi era allowed for a more open discussion of the past. survivors began to speak out. Historians and journalists started to uncover the truth. Documentaries like The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence brought the horror of 1965 to the world stage. They showed the perpetrators, many of whom were still in power, boasting about their crimes. The world could no longer ignore the scale of the tragedy. In 2017, the US government released thousands of declassified documents, confirming what many had suspected. The US had known about the killings from the start and had actively supported them. In 2015, the International People's Tribunal on 1965 crimes against humanity in Indonesia was held in The Hague. The tribunal found the Indonesian state guilty of crimes against humanity and genocide. It concluded that the US, UK and Australia were complicit. But the Indonesian government rejected the ruling, and no legal accountability has followed. Today, the scars of 1965 remain. The PKY is still banned. The official narrative is still largely unchallenged in Indonesian schools, but the truth is out. The world knows that this was not a civil war or a communist coup. It was a mass murder orchestrated by the military, facilitated by foreign powers, and covered up for decades. The 500,000 to 1 million people who died in those 6 months were not just numbers. They were fathers, mothers, children, artists, and teachers. They were victims of a political purge that changed the course of history. The story of Indonesia, 1965, is a reminder of the fragility of democracy and the power of propaganda. It shows how easily fear can be weaponized and how quickly a nation can turn on its own people. It also serves as a warning about the role of foreign powers in the internal affairs of other nations. The Cold War was not just fought with missiles and spies. It was fought with lies, with lists of names, and with the blood of innocent civilians. As we look back on this dark chapter, we must remember the victims. We must demand the truth, and we must ensure that such a tragedy never happens again, because silence is the greatest ally of those who commit crimes against humanity.